Poland has been saying from the start that military expenditure should be taken out of this 3% limit. What do you think? Is there a reason for why in the European Commission and in Brussels in general there is no agreement on this issue?
The Italians tried to have an agreement too, to take the military, not spending all of it, but the investment in equipment out of this 3% rule. And it was shut down by some guy from Berlin called Scholz, because the Germans have this obsession with the 3% rule, and basically the Italians should reduce pensions or salaries for teachers to find the money to produce weapons for Ukraine, which is a non-starter. And I believe almost 50 to 60% of European nations would love, European Union, Eurozone members would love to take military spending out of the 3% rule. All the Eastern Europeans, all the Southern Europeans, probably also one of the Scandinavians. But the hawks on this, which is Germany, the Dutch, and the Finns, and the Austrians, are just blocking it.
And it's worth remembering here as well that when it comes to the 3% deficit rule, France was breaking it for years and years. And when asked about why the European Union did not take action against him, Jean-Claude Juncker famously stated that, well, France is France. So it turns out that some member states sometimes can break the rules, but in this important issue, as the war in Ukraine is, this is actually another question. Do people in Europe fully grasp the magnitude of what a complete Ukrainian loss would mean, and what it would mean if Ukraine would be swallowed up in the same way that it was swallowed up after World War I, when the Soviet Union managed to incorporate it and make it a part of the Soviet Union? Already we have the union state between Belarus and Russia. If Ukraine would be forced into such a situation with a new pro-Russian government installed in Kiev, and with the Russian army stationed in Lviv, for example, or close to Odessa, not far from Romania, do people in Western Europe grasp how this would change the security balance on the European continent?
Not at all. Let me tell you, if the Russians make it to Kiev and further west, 15 million Ukrainians, 20 million Ukrainians will flee. 90% of this country, the Ukrainian nation, fears the Russians because they know the Russians will bring death, concentration camps, rape, murder, executions, theft, pillaging, horrific torture. So there would be 20 million Ukrainians fleeing to the west. The population of all of Austria, all of Switzerland, and then throw in some Belgium would flee. The people cannot imagine. It would be the biggest flight of humans ever. Second thing, once Russian troops are at the European Union's outer border, the Europeans have to sacrifice their own children. There will be the draft. At 18, since we are in the modern times, boys and girls will go to the military. There will be 30,000 Italians stationed in Romania, 40,000 Germans in Poland, 40,000 French in Slovakia. It will be a Cold War, staring down again a lunatic regime with nuclear weapons. So if the Europeans don't want to have their children stay there a year on the autumn border with a continued fear that the Russians might invade or use nukes, then help Ukrainians. People have forgotten the Cold War. It's going to be back. Our goal must be to liberate Belarus and help Ukraine win. We need a Europe, as the German foreign minister said yesterday, free and united from Lisbon to Luhansk in Ukraine. And it has to be a Europe not with the Russian, but against the Russians. Because what Europeans don't understand, this is a pure fascist regime. Every aspect of this, I'm a German speaker from Italy. So the two worst fascist regimes, I can read the original Mussolini speeches, Hitler speeches, and I can compare them because I speak Russian. I try to forget it, please, people. I'm really trying to forget the Russian, but I can still read it. So there's so little difference. I could make here a whole game with you, Adam, where I read excerpts from speeches of these three guys, Hitler, Mussolini, and Putin, and let you guess who said it. And it would have been difficult for you to figure out, is this a Mussolini, a Putin, or a Hitler speech? Because this is a pure fascist regime. And fascists have never enough. Have they taken Ukraine? It's Estonia. Have they taken Estonia? It's Latvia. Taken Latvia? They're going for Lithuania. Have they Lithuania? As they say in the Russian TV openly, we have to beat Ukraine, defeat the Baltics, invade Warsaw, and return to Berlin.
Yes, the return to Berlin was clearly written on tanks, helicopters, and other pieces of Russian military equipment that were on their way to Kiev back in 2022. So it does seem likely that this is not just rhetoric. There is a large part of Russian society who has this imperial mindset in which they are willing to themselves live with a lower quality of life, less economic opportunities, as long as they know that they are feared by their neighbors. It's unfortunately a mentality which has existed in Russia for centuries and can partly explain their economic malaise, their bad fortunes.
Let me go in here. This is an important point that we need to make people understand. When people say it's not all the Russians, it's just Putin. Mm. Grab a history book. There was more resistance to Hitler in Germany between 1940 and 1945 than there is now in Russia against Putin. In Germany, any wrong word meant death. And there was still more resistance by the Germans in the religious Catholic circles, Protestant circle, in the military even. They tried 6-7 times to kill Hitler. That nobody tried to kill Putin so far in Russia. So that this story, the Russians are not for the war, they're not into it. No. The Germans under Hitler were braver and fought back against this regime harder than the Russians against what happens now in Russia. So stop saying the Russians are victims here. The Russians are guilty.
It's also worth mentioning that even during the Soviet-Afghan war, during the first Chechen war, you had cases of Russian mothers gathering at the Red Square protesting against the war. So far we have practically not seen anything like this at all. There were a couple of protests during the first weeks of the war, but they were very small in scale and they were very quickly pacified by the regime.
Let's go back to this. In Germany, the White Rose protest group in Munich under the Hitler regime had more members than we have seen in all of Russia demonstrate against Putin in the last 2 years. So there's one cell in Germany, in Munich, that was active for a few months. It had more members than what we have seen in Russia. So please spare me this Russians are victim stuff. I cannot hear it anymore. And people, please, if someone tells you that, ask them the question, who do you think has resisted more? Germans, Hitler, or Russians, Putin? And then draw your conclusions. Thank you.
You mentioned here that you know how to speak German, you know how to speak Italian. You were born and raised, if I understand correctly, in Italy, and you also served in the Italian army. And their artillery was, from what I understand, your specialization, so to say. Many have claimed that this war has turned into an artillery war. After the first initial push towards Kiev, the battles in the Donbass that took place later in the summer, and also during the autumn, there was a little bit more of mobility with the offensives in Kherson and Kharkiv. But nevertheless, artillery production, especially artillery shell production, is at the forefront. Why aren't we producing more artillery shells? Is there any incapacity on our side, and how quickly could we overcome this problem?
The problem is that artillery production is highly complex, and the Europeans killed all of the factories after the Cold War. I mean, you have to produce the shell, which is the outer metal body, which should then splinter and the splinters kill the shrapnel. So you cannot just make a metal thing. It has to be also robust because you fire it at extreme pressures and high speeds. Once you have done that, you have to fill it. You liquefy TNT or composite P. You really liquefy it and you squeeze it in because it must be completely evenly filled. You need a factory for that. And it's a complex factory because you're basically having hundreds of tons of explosives and you liquefy it. And if it's going wrong, you blow up a city. Then you have a shell, which is useless because you need the fuse that detonates it, which is a mechanical or electronic on the tip of the shell, the fuse that detonates it once it reaches its destination. That has to be worked. It's complex. We don't have the production facilities for that either. Then you need the charges because you have to fire it out of the gun. You need the charge that basically is the explosive that, like the gunpowder that propels it. We haven't those factories too. The Germans found a way basically to avoid having these poisonous chemicals in Germany by producing them in South Africa, where the economics are cheaper and environmental laws are not as stringent as in Germany. So we have to produce the charges. Then we have to produce the primers. And the Americans have spent $1 billion to increase factory production, and the Europeans are just trying to make the best use of the existing factories because these productions are a dangerous and chemical process which result in also residues, chemical residues. That, for example, in Germany, the environmental laws are so stringent that Rheinmetall would love to have a second factory and invest 400 million, but they're probably going to make it just over the German border in Czechia or in Poland because you can't get it off the ground in Germany. Italy would love to expand its production in Sardinia, but Italy has a stringent 3% rule, and basically the government cannot throw $500 million at a new factory because private companies can't make this investment unless the government either pays for the factory or tells them we will buy an immense amount of shells for the next 10 years.